In the harsh winter of 1885, Sarah Winters found herself standing at a crossroads outside Denver, clutching her two shivering boys close. Just 3 weeks after burying her husband, her in-laws had stripped them of their inheritance and cast them out into the bitter cold. With nothing but a worn carpetbag and her wedding ring, she faced a world that showed little mercy to widows. That's when Thomas Reed, a weathered cowboy with calloused hands and gentle eyes, happened upon them. On his modest homestead, they found more than just shelter. They discovered the meaning of true family. Between morning chores and evening prayers, something beautiful began to bloom in the most unexpected of places. What secrets from Thomas's past threaten to shatter this fragile happiness they've built? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gravediggers hadn't even finished their work when Harold Winters approached his brother's widow. Sarah stood beneath a grey November sky, her gloved hands resting protectively on her son's shoulders. 8-year-old James and 6-year-old William remained perfectly still, their small faces pinched with confusion and grief. "We need to discuss the estate," Harold said, his words cutting through the cemetery's solemn silence. Behind him, his wife Margaret's thin lips curved into what might have been meant as a sympathetic smile. Sarah tightened her grip on the boy's shoulders. "Surely this can wait until tomorrow, Harold. The children are precisely why this cannot wait." Harold adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles with practiced precision. Their future must be secured. That evening, seated in what had been her husband Michael's study, Sarah realized how thoroughly her in-laws had planned their attack. The leather chairs that had once felt welcoming now seemed to swallow her whole, as Harold produced document after document, each bearing her husband's signature. "As you can see," Harold's voice carried the smooth confidence of a man who had never known. Michael entrusted me with certain responsibilities regarding the business holdings. Given the current circumstances," Sarah's fingers traced the edge of the letter in her lap, the last one Michael had written her before the fever took him. "Michael would never have intended, my brother, God rest his soul, intended to protect his sons from the possibility of—" Harold paused, examining Sarah as if she were a questionable piece of merchandise. "Imprudent management." William tugged at Sarah's sleeve from his perch beside her chair. "Mama, when's Papa coming home?" The question pierced her heart anew. Before she could answer, Margaret spoke from her position by the fireplace. "Your father is with the angels, dear, which is why your Uncle Harold must ensure you're properly provided for." Over the next 3 weeks, Sarah watched helplessly as her world contracted. The house, her home of 9 years, was to be sold. The business holdings would be managed by Harold in trust for the boys. Their clothing, their toys, even Michael's pocket watch that James had always loved to wind, all catalogued and claimed for safekeeping. When Sarah discovered the deed to their modest summer cabin had also been transferred to Harold's name, she finally broke her silence. "You cannot mean to take everything. Where are we to go?" Harold's response was as cold as the wind rattling. The study windows. "I understand the Methodist Ladies' Aid Society has a program for—" He cleared his throat. "Unfortunate women and their children." "Unfortunate?" Sarah stood, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I am your brother's widow, Harold. These are his sons. And they will be educated and provided for appropriately," Margaret interjected, "once suitable arrangements are made." Sarah read the unspoken threat in their eyes. They would separate her from her boys if given the chance, claiming unfitness or moral turpitude, anything to secure their complete control over Michael's legacy. That night, after the boys had fallen into uneasy sleep, Sarah packed what she could carry in her carpetbag. The wedding ring on her finger, the one possession they hadn't dared demand, caught the lamplight as she wrote a hasty note to her friend Clara. By dawn, they were gone, trudging through the first heavy snow of winter toward the stagecoach station. 4 days later, Their meager funds depleted by travel costs and cold nights in shabby boarding houses, Sarah found herself standing at that fateful crossroads outside Denver. William's mittened hand clutched hers, while James, trying so hard to be brave, peered down each fork of the road as if one might magically lead them home. "Mama!" William whispered, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face. "I'm cold." Sarah pulled him closer, sharing what warmth she could. The worn carpetbag at her feet contained all that remained of their life: 2 changes of clothes each, Michael's Bible, a daguerreotype of happier days, and a handful of biscuits wrapped in a clean handkerchief. She had no answer for her shivering child, no comfort to offer except her embrace. That's when they heard the approaching hoofbeats, and Sarah's heart clenched with fear. Had Harold's men found them already? She turned, positioning herself between her boys and whatever threat the road might bring, ready to fight with the fierce desperation of a mother protecting her cubs. The rider who emerged through the swirling snow wasn't one of Harold's men. Thomas Reed sat tall in his saddle, his broad-brimmed hat crusted with ice, reins held in gloved hands that spoke of honest work. His horse, a sturdy brown gelding, snorted clouds of steam into the winter air. "Ma'am!" He touched the brim of his hat, eyes taking in the scene before him. A woman and 2 young boys, clearly ill-equipped for the bitter Colorado winter. "Might be bold of me to say, but you folks look like you could use some shelter." Sarah hesitated, years of propriety warring with desperate circumstance. James pressed against her side, while William peered up at the stranger with undisguised curiosity. "We're quite all right, thank you," Sarah managed, though her voice betrayed her exhaustion. Thomas dismounted, movements deliberate and unthreatening. "My ranch is just over that rise. Not much to look at, but it's warm, and I've got soup on." "The stove." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "No strings attached, ma'am. Just wouldn't sit right with me, leaving you folks out here with night coming on." Something in his steady gaze, not pity but simple human kindness, broke through Sarah's resolve. When William sneezed, the decision was made for her. The ranch was indeed modest, a sturdy log house with a stone chimney, a barn that had seen better days, and a few outbuildings hunched against the wind. But warm light spilled from the windows, and the promised soup smell greeted them as Thomas led them inside. "Been meaning to tidy up," he said, hastily clearing books from the kitchen table. Sarah noticed they weren't the dime novels one might expect, but rather volumes of Shakespeare, Wordsworth, and what appeared to be scientific texts. Thomas disappeared briefly into another room and returned with a quilt, faded but clean. "My mother made this," he said, draping it around William's shoulders. "Saved my life more than once during bad winters." The boys sat at the table while Thomas ladled out soup, a hearty mix of beans and salt pork with chunks of potato. Sarah watched him move around his kitchen with the ease of long habit, noting how he served the children first, how he kept his movements measured and calm. "You've a nice library, Mr. Reed," she ventured after the boys had eaten their fill. "Thomas, please." He smiled slightly. "And yes, books keep me company during the long winters. Man can't work outside all the time, after all." That night, Thomas insisted Sarah and the boys take his bedroom while he slept in the main room. The bedroom was simple but clean, with more books stacked on a small table and a worn Bible on the nightstand. A charcoal sketch of a woman, Thomas's mother perhaps, hung on one wall, the only decoration in the room. As Sarah tucked her sons into the narrow bed, William whispered, "Mama, is this our new home?" "Hush, darling, we're just guests for tonight." But even as she said it, Sarah felt something shift inside her. A tiny spark of hope she hadn't dared entertain since Michael's death. Through the thin walls, she could hear Thomas moving quietly around the main room, banking the fire for the night. The sound should have made her nervous, a strange man so close while she and her boys slept vulnerable. Instead, it felt oddly comforting, like the steady tick of a grandfather clock marking time's passage. James was already asleep, but William struggled to keep his eyes open. "Mr. Thomas has nice eyes," he murmured, "like Papa's dog Scout used to have." Sarah smoothed his hair back from his forehead. Trust a child to make such an observation. And he wasn't wrong. Thomas's eyes held. That same steady, loyal quality she remembered in Michael's old hunting dog. Outside, the wind howled around the corners of the house, but here, wrapped in Thomas's mother's quilt, its fierce bite couldn't reach them. Sarah lay awake long into the night, listening to her boy's steady breathing and wondering what tomorrow would bring. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to imagine a future that held more than mere survival. The wedding ring on her finger caught the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Sarah touched it gently, remembering Michael's face when he'd placed it there. "Guide me," she whispered to his memory. "Help me protect our boys." No answer came from the quiet night, but somehow, in this stranger's home, she felt closer to peace than she had since the day the fever took her husband. Dawn arrived with the quiet sounds of ranch life, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of hay being moved in the barn, the crackle of a freshly stoked fire. Sarah woke to find her boys still sleeping soundly, their faces peaceful in the grey morning light. In the kitchen, Thomas was already up, a leather-bound ledger open before him as he made careful notations with a well-worn pencil. The sight of him, bent over his bookkeeping, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose, struck Sarah as incongruous with her initial impression of the weathered rancher. "Coffee's hot," he said without looking up, gesturing toward the pot on the stove. "And there's bread from yesterday if you're hungry." Sarah poured herself a cup, studying the neat columns of numbers in his ledger. "You keep very precise records." "Have to," Thomas replied, removing his spectacles. "Ranch this size, every penny counts, every head of cattle, every bale of hay. It all needs accounting." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of small feet padding across the wooden floor. William appeared, still wrapped in Thomas's mother's quilt, his hair tousled from sleep. "Mama, I smelled bread." Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "How about you help me? Feed the chickens first, young man. Earn your breakfast." William's eyes lit up, but he looked to Sarah for permission. She nodded, heart warming at her younger son's enthusiasm. "James can help with the bigger chores when he wakes," Thomas added. "If that's all right with you, Mom." "Sarah," she corrected gently. "And yes, it would be good for them to learn." While William followed Thomas outside, Sarah explored the main room more thoroughly in the morning light. The bookshelves revealed an educated mind. Volumes of poetry shared space with practical guides to animal husbandry and farming techniques. A battered copy of Euclid's Elements bore Thomas's name inside the cover, dated 15 years prior. James emerged from the bedroom just as William burst back inside, cheeks red with cold and excitement. "Mama, I helped collect eggs, and Mr. Thomas showed me how to check if they're good ones." "That's wonderful, darling." Sarah helped him remove his boots, now caked with snow and mud. "There's a new calf in the barn," Thomas announced, stamping snow from his own boots. "James, would you like to help me check on her? Might need an extra pair of hands." James, still shy but clearly intrigued, nodded. Sarah watched through the window as Thomas led her older son to the barn, taking shorter steps to match the boy's pace, pointing out various features of the ranch as they walked. While the men were out, Sarah discovered a small desk in the corner, its drawers containing more evidence of Thomas's hidden depths. Carefully preserved letters spoke of a man who had once attended university back east, who had taught school briefly before coming west. The writing was elegant, educated, a sharp contrast to his calloused hands and sun-weathered face. "Found my secrets, have you?" Thomas's voice was gentle, without accusation. Sarah turned to find him watching her from the doorway, James at his side. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have pried." "No harm done." He moved to the desk, pulling out a letter. "Was studying to be a professor once, if you can believe it. Life had other plans." "What changed?" Sarah asked, noting how James lingered near Thomas, clearly fascinated by this revelation about their host. "War came. After that," he shrugged, tucking the letter away. "Sometimes The quiet of the mountains heals better than all the books. In the world, James spoke up unexpectedly. Could you teach us about the books? Thomas's expression softened. I reckon I could if your mama approves. Been a while since I had anyone to share these old volumes with. Sarah watched her normally. Reserved sun light up at the prospect, and something inside her chest tightened. This man, with his gentle manner and hidden wisdom, was offering her children something she hadn't even known they needed, a glimpse of a future beyond mere survival. The first sign of trouble came a week into their stay, announced by the distant sound of approaching horses. Thomas was teaching James how to mend a fence, while Sarah and William sorted through dried beans at the kitchen table. The rhythm of their days had settled into something almost comfortable, making the intrusion all the more jarring. "Sarah," Thomas called from outside, his voice carrying a note of warning, "might want to get the boys inside." She quickly ushered William in from the kitchen porch, watching through the window as 3 riders approached. Their bearing suggested authority, not the desperate meanness of Harold's men, but something potentially just as dangerous, official scrutiny. The lead rider wore a silver star on his coat. Sheriff Daniel Morton, Sarah would later learn, had served the county for 15 years and prided himself on knowing every soul in his jurisdiction. Thomas Reed, with his solitary ways and educated manner, had always been something of a puzzle to him. "Reed," the sheriff called out, reining his horse to a stop. "Notice smoke from your chimney's been steady this past week, unusual for a man living alone." Thomas continued with his fence work, though Sarah noticed how he positioned himself between the riders and the house. "Winter's been cold, Sheriff. Been staying in more than usual." "That's so?" Morton's deputy, a younger man with a weasel-like face, peered toward the house. "Thought I saw a woman's wash on the line yesterday when I rode past." Sarah's hands clenched at the implied accusation in his tone. Through the window, she saw Thomas straighten slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. "My guests," he said simply. "A widow and her 2 boys, caught out in the storm last week. Couldn't leave them to freeze." The third rider, whom Sarah recognized as Ezra Wheeler from his general store's sign in town, clicked his tongue. "Mighty charitable of you, Reed, though charity usually involves the church or aid society, not taking folks into your private home." "Mrs. Winters and her sons are respectable people," Thomas replied, his voice level but carrying an edge of steel. "Nothing untoward about offering Christian kindness to those in need." The sheriff dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow. The badge on his chest caught the winter sunlight as he approached Thomas. No law against kindness, sure enough. But this county's seen its share of trouble from drifters and con artists. "You vouching for these folks?" The moment stretched taut as a fiddle string. Sarah found herself holding her breath, one hand resting protectively on William's shoulder, while James pressed against her other side. "I am." Thomas's voice never wavered. "And I'd appreciate it if you'd mind how you speak of them. Mrs. Winters is a lady of quality, and those boys are as well-mannered as any you'd find in Denver's finest homes." Something in his tone must have carried conviction, for the sheriff's stance relaxed slightly. "Well then, suppose we should meet this lady of quality, proper introductions being the civilized thing and all." Sarah squared her shoulders, smoothed her skirts, and stepped out onto the porch. She'd faced down Harold's cold manipulation. She could certainly handle a small-town sheriff's suspicions. "Gentlemen," she said, letting just a touch of Denver society enter her voice. "I'm Sarah Winters. My sons and I are indeed guests of Mr. Reed's kindness, though we won't impose upon him longer than necessary." The sheriff studied her with shrewd eyes, taking in her bearing, her speech, the simple but quality material of her dress. "Boy's father? Taken by fever this past autumn." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "My brother-in-law's management of the estate left us with few options." Wheeler shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Sarah noticed how his expression changed. The story of a wealthy relative taking advantage of a widow and children was one that resonated in these parts. "Well," the sheriff said finally, "welcome to the county, Mrs. Winters." though you might. Consider more conventional lodgings once the weather allows. Mrs. Peterson at the boarding house in town takes in respectable ladies. Thank you, Sheriff. I'll keep that in mind. The words were polite, but Sarah let a hint of frost enter her tone. These men had no right to judge Thomas's generosity or her acceptance of it. After the riders departed, Thomas remained by the fence for a long moment, his back straight as a pine tree. When he finally turned toward the house, Sarah saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Not anger at the intrusion or embarrassment at the implications, but a fierce protectiveness that stole her breath. The storm came without warning, the way mountain weather often does. One moment the February sky was clear, the next dark clouds rolled over the peaks like a cavalry charge. Thomas had been teaching the boys about cattle when he first spotted the approaching wall of white. "Inside, quick now," he ordered, but James shook his head stubbornly. "The new calf," the boy insisted. "She's still in the far pasture." Thomas pulled his father's pocket watch from his vest, a habit of long years, and checked the time. They might have 20 minutes before the storm hit if they were lucky. "Your mama will have my hide if anything happens to you." "Then we'll both go," James said, sounding so much older than his 8 years. "Two pairs of eyes are better than one." There was no time to argue. Thomas sent William running to the house to warn Sarah, then mounted his horse, pulling James up behind him. They rode hard for the pasture, the wind picking up around them, carrying the first stinging flakes of snow. They found the calf, huddled against a fence post, her mother nowhere in sight. The wind was howling now, visibility dropping by the second. Thomas dismounted, handed James the reins, and approached the frightened animal. "Easy there, little one," he murmured, working to calm the calf. Behind him, he could hear James talking softly to the horse, keeping it steady despite the worsening weather. The next few moments happened with the terrible speed of disaster. A blast of wind spooked the horse, causing it to rear. James, trying to maintain control, lost his grip on the reins. Thomas turned at the sound of the boy's startled cry, and in that instant of distraction, the calf bolted. Without thinking, Thomas dove to protect James from the horse's panicked hooves. They fell together in the deepening snow, and Thomas felt something crack against his chest. His father's watch caught between them. The horse galloped away toward the barn, leaving them stranded in the teeth of the storm. Thomas pulled James close against him, using his body as a shield against the wind. "You hurt?" "No, sir." James's voice shook, but with cold rather than fear. "The calf, gone to find her mama, most likely. They're smarter than we give them credit for." Thomas tried to get his bearings, but the whiteout conditions made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. "We need to move." They began walking, Thomas keeping a firm grip on James's shoulder. The boy stumbled occasionally, but never complained, showing a grit that squeezed Thomas's heart with pride, a feeling that surprised him with its intensity. Time became meaningless in the howling white world around them. Thomas's fingers found the broken watch in his pocket, its familiar weight now altered forever. A family heirloom sacrificed in an instant to protect this boy who wasn't his. And he knew with absolute certainty he'd make the same choice again. A shape loomed ahead. The barn, by God's grace. They'd walked in a circle and found home. As they stumbled through the door, Sarah's voice cut through the storm's roar. "James! Thomas!" She was there with William, lantern in hand, face white, with worry. James ran to her embrace, while Thomas secured the barn door against the wind. "The calf," James began, but Sarah was already checking him for injuries. "Hush about the calf. Are you hurt? Either of you?" Her eyes found Thomas's, filled with a mixture of relief and something deeper that made his breath catch. "We're fine," he assured her, though his chest ached where the watch had been crushed. "Your boy showed real courage out there." The storm raged for hours, trapping them in the barn. They made themselves comfortable in the hayloft, Thomas and Sarah taking turns watching over the sleeping boys. During one quiet moment, Thomas showed her the broken watch. "It was my father's," he explained. "Last thing he gave me before I left for university, told me to make every minute count." Sarah touched the cracked face gently. "I'd say you honored his words today." Their eyes met in the lantern light, and Thomas felt something shift between them, like a key turning in, a lock he hadn't known existed. The storm's violence only emphasized the peaceful silence of that moment, filled with unspoken understanding. When William stirred in his sleep, Sarah automatically reached to smooth his hair. Thomas watched her maternal gesture and realized that somewhere in the past weeks, these three had become more than just guests in his home. They'd become the family he'd never dared to dream of having again. Spring came to the ranch like a painting being unveiled, each day revealing new colors. The snow retreated first from the southern slopes, then from the pastures, leaving behind tender green shoots that promised renewal. Sarah watched the transformation from the kitchen window, her hands deep in bread dough, marveling at how different the world looked when hope was allowed to take root. Thomas had spread his mother's quilt on the grass near the house, where William practiced his letters while James helped with the spring carving. The boy's confidence had grown steadily since the storm, his bond with Thomas deepening into something that made Sarah's heart ache with both joy and uncertainty. "Look what I found in the barn loft," Thomas said one evening, spreading a weathered piece of parchment across the kitchen table. It was a hand-drawn map of the ranch, the ink faded, but still clear enough to read. "Been meaning to show you this?" Sarah wiped her hands on her apron, leaning closer to study the detailed drawings. The map showed not just the current boundaries of the ranch, but dotted lines indicating possible expansion, new pastures, a larger garden plot, and "Is that meant to be a schoolhouse?" She pointed to a small square marked near the eastern edge of the property. Thomas nodded, a hint of color touching his weathered cheeks. "Was just dreaming, really, drawing possibilities. There are other families scattered in these hills, children who could use some learning, and with your boys already showing such aptitude." He trailed off, but Sarah understood what he wasn't saying. He'd been planning for their future, mapping out a way they could stay, build something permanent. The realization brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "The south pasture," she said quickly, blinking them away. "It looks perfect for the new cattle you mentioned." "That it does." Thomas's voice was gentle, acknowledging her deflection while respecting it. "Thought we might start clearing it next week if you're amenable to staying on through summer." Before Sarah could respond, James burst through the door, his face glowing with excitement. "Ma, Mr. Thomas, the mare's about to foal." They spent the next hours in the barn, watching new life enter the world. Sarah found herself working alongside Thomas with an ease that spoke of growing familiarity, anticipating his needs, passing tools before he asked, steadying the mare while he guided the foal. William fell asleep in the hay, exhausted by the excitement. As James helped Thomas settle the new mother and baby, Sarah studied them in the lantern light. Her older son had picked up Thomas's mannerisms, the way he moved with careful deliberation, spoke with thoughtful pauses, even held his shoulders with the same quiet strength. Later, after the boys were tucked into their beds, no longer Thomas's room in anyone's mind but theirs, Sarah returned to the kitchen to find him adding to the map. "Just marking where we might put a proper flower garden," he explained. "Come spring, the wild roses bloom something fierce on that western slope. Thought we might transplant some closer to the house." Sarah touched the paper gently, tracing the lines of the future he'd drawn. "You've put such thought into this. Too much, perhaps." Thomas set down his pencil, meeting her eyes. "I know you never asked for any of this. Never meant to presume." "You've presumed nothing," Sarah said softly. "You've only offered possibilities." The silence between them was comfortable now, laden with unspoken understanding. Through the window, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Sarah remembered other spring evenings, another life, when such quiet moments had been taken for granted. "The boys need stability," she said finally, "a place to put down roots." Thomas nodded, carefully rolling up the map. "Roots need good soil to grow strong. Reckon we've got that here, if you're willing to test it." Sarah looked around the kitchen, at the fresh baked bread cooling on the rack, The herbs she'd started drying from the kitchen garden, the slate where William had proudly written his name that morning. Somewhere in the past months, this place had ceased to be simply shelter from desperation. It had become something else entirely. "I think," she said slowly, "we might be ready to do more than test it." Thomas's smile was like sunrise breaking. Over the mountains, full of promise and possibility. Together they bent over the map again, planning tomorrow. The old family Bible had sat untouched on Thomas's shelf since Sarah and the boys arrived, its leather binding worn smooth by years of handling. It wasn't until William's innocent question about the faded daguerreotype tucked between its pages that the past finally found its voice. "Who's the pretty lady, Mr. Thomas?" The boy had been helping to dust the shelves, his natural curiosity leading him to the discovered treasure. Sarah looked up from her mending to see Thomas frozen in the doorway, his face gone suddenly pale. The woman in the image was young, perhaps Sarah's age, with dark hair arranged in an old-fashioned style and eyes that seemed to hold both mischief and grace. "That's Elizabeth," Thomas said finally, his voice rough with memory. "My wife." The word hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt her heart contract, though whether from surprise or something deeper, she couldn't say. "You were married?" James asked from his place by the fire, where he'd been reading one of Thomas's books of poetry. Thomas crossed the room slowly, taking the Bible from William's careful hands. A lifetime ago, it seems now. He sat heavily in his chair, the one Sarah had come to think of as his natural place in the evening hours. "Might as well tell you the whole of it." He opened the Bible, revealing more photographs, letters, and pressed flowers. A life preserved between sacred pages. "We were young, Elizabeth and I. Met at university where I was studying literature and she was visiting her brother. Married. In '62, just before I joined up." "The war?" Sarah asked softly, understanding now why he'd left his academic pursuits behind. Thomas nodded, carefully removing one of the letters. "She wrote to me every week. Beautiful letters, full of hope and plans for after. We were going to open a school together." His smile held more sorrow than joy. "She was carrying our child. When the fever took them both in '64, I was still in Virginia, couldn't even make it back for the burial." William climbed into Thomas's lap, his small hand touching the photograph with infinite gentleness. "She looks kind, like Mama." "William," Sarah began, but Thomas shook his head. "He's right. She was kind. Would have loved having you boys around. Filling this house with life like you do." He tucked the photograph back into the Bible. "After I lost them, couldn't bear to stay east. Too many memories, too many well-meaning folks trying to help me move on. Came out here looking for silence, I suppose. Found it too, for better or worse." Sarah understood then why he'd been so quick to offer them shelter that winter day. He knew the weight of loss, the way it could hollow out a person's world. "Thank you for sharing this with us," she said quietly. James had moved closer, drawn by the story. "Is that why you have so many books? To remember being a teacher?" "Partly." Thomas's voice had steadied now, as if sharing the burden had somehow lightened it. "But mostly because good books are like good friends. They stay with you through the hard times." Sarah watched as he showed the boys other treasures from the Bible. A pressed flower from his wedding day, a ribbon Elizabeth had worn in her hair, the program from a Shakespeare play they'd seen together. Each item was handled with reverence, not just by Thomas but by her sons, who seemed to instinctively understand the sacred nature of these memories. Later, after the boys were asleep, Sarah found Thomas still sitting with the Bible open in his lap. "I should have told you sooner," he said, without looking up. "No," she replied, taking the chair opposite him. "Some stories need their own time to be told. Been a long while since I looked at these." He closed the Bible carefully. "Forgot how it feels, sharing memories with people who understand their worth." The fire had burned low, casting gentle shadows across the room. Outside, a spring rain had begun to fall, its steady rhythm underlining the intimacy of the moment. "Does it get easier?" Sarah asked, touching her wedding ring. "The missing?" "Not easier, Thomas said thoughtfully. Different. Like a wound that heals but leaves a mark. Reminds you where you've been, what you've survived. He looked at her then, his eyes holding steady. Reminds you that your heart's still capable of feeling. The summer market in town brought all of Clear Creek County together, turning the dusty main street into a bustling fairground of wagons, stalls, and hopeful sellers. Sarah hadn't planned to attend until Thomas presented her with a package wrapped in brown paper one evening. "Ordered it from Denver," he said, uncharacteristically hesitant. "Thought you might want something new for market day." Inside was a dress of deep blue cotton, practical enough for country wear, but styled with a grace that spoke of city shops. Sarah ran her fingers over the fabric, throat tight with unexpected emotion. "It's beautiful," she managed, "but you shouldn't have." "Already done," Thomas cut in gently. "Besides, we need to show those town folks that the Reed Ranch is prospering." The morning of the market dawned clear and warm. Sarah wore the new dress, her hair arranged with care she hadn't bothered with in months. The boys were scrubbed clean, wearing their best shirts, while Thomas had trimmed his beard and donned a fresh collar. They loaded the wagon with their goods, fresh eggs, butter Sarah had churned herself, early vegetables from the kitchen garden she'd expanded. James proudly added the first jar of honey from the hives Thomas had helped him tend, while William carefully packed the arithmetic primer he'd completed. The ride to town felt like a journey into another world. Sarah was acutely aware of every glance, every whispered comment as they made their way down the main street. The spring's rumors about Thomas Reed's unusual house guests had evolved into summer's speculation about their relationship. "Mrs. Winters," Ezra Wheeler's wife called out, her false brightness carrying across the street. "How domestic you look today." Before Sarah could respond, Thomas was there beside her, his hand steady at her elbow. "Mrs. Wheeler, hope you'll stop by our stall. Sarah's preserves put my old bachelor efforts to shame." His quiet pride in her accomplishments, the natural way he included her in the ranch's success, silenced the implied criticism in Mrs. Wheeler's greeting. Sarah felt herself straightening, drawing strength from his presence. The boys soon drew attention of their own. James's careful explanation of beekeeping to the schoolmaster led to discussions of his other studies, while William's quick arithmetic impressed several merchants. "Thomas Reed's boys are sharp as new pins," she overheard one man say, and the casual claiming in the phrase warmed her heart. Mid-morning brought an unexpected visitor to their stall. Sheriff Morton's wife, a tiny woman with shrewd eyes, examined Sarah's preserves with professional interest. "Wild raspberry?" she asked, holding a jar to the light. "Haven't seen these offered before." "Found a patch up near the North Creek," Sarah explained. "Thomas showed me where the best berries grow." Mrs. Morton's eyes missed nothing, not the quality of Sarah's new dress, not the easy way Thomas included her in discussions with other ranchers, not the boys' clear attachment to him, but her approval when it came carried weight. "You'll join us for Sunday socials now, I trust," she said, purchasing 3 jars. "The church ladies have been curious about the woman who's brought such changes to Thomas Reed's life." The invitation represented more than mere socializing. It was acceptance, legitimacy, the community's blessing on their unusual arrangement. Sarah felt Thomas tense beside her, ready to defend their independence, but she touched his arm gently. "We'd be honored," she replied, meeting Mrs. Morton's gaze steadily. "Though ranch work doesn't always respect the social calendar." The older woman smiled, genuine warmth replacing her earlier reserve. "My Henry says the Reed Ranch is showing real improvements this year. Amazing what a family's touch can do." By day's end, they'd sold most of their goods and received invitations to 3 different church suppers. The boys were tired but happy, William falling asleep against Thomas's shoulder as they loaded the wagon for home. "Successful day," Thomas observed quietly as they drove back under the evening sky. "Though I suspect it wasn't just our preserves they came to inspect." Sarah smoothed her new dress, still marveling at its perfect fit. "Let them look," she said with newfound confidence. "We have nothing to hide." The dress, she realized, was More than a gift, it was a declaration. Thomas Reed's way of announcing to the world that his household, unconventional as it might be, was one of prosperity and purpose. A family finding its footing in the fertile soil of trust and care. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a smartly dressed lawyer from Denver who looked distinctly uncomfortable about the dust coating his polished boots. Sarah recognized the firm's letterhead before she even broke the seal. Harold's. Lawyers, with their practiced way of making threats, sound like concerned advice. "Ma'am," the lawyer, who had introduced himself as Mr. Blackwood, cleared his throat. "Mr. Harold Winters is naturally concerned about his nephew's welfare. Their education, their moral upbringing." Thomas stood in the doorway, his shadow falling across the kitchen table where the legal documents lay spread out like a web. Sarah felt his presence like a shield at her back as she read the carefully worded demands. "He's petitioning for custody," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clutching at her throat. "Claims I've abandoned proper society and am living in circumstances unbecoming to children of gentle breeding." Mr. Blackwood had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Your brother-in-law is prepared to be generous. The boys would attend the finest schools in Denver, and you would receive a modest stipend." "To give up my sons?" Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Harold's generosity comes with steel teeth, Mr. Blackwood. I learned that lesson when he stripped us of everything else." "The courts tend to favor blood relations, Mrs. Winters." The lawyer's voice was almost apologetic, especially when those relations can provide advantages that a current situation cannot. Thomas moved then, not toward the lawyer, but to the window where James and William were visible in the garden, helping the sheriff's wife select fresh vegetables for her preserves. Mrs. Morton had become a regular visitor, her friendship a bridge to wider community acceptance. "Those boys," Thomas said quietly, "can read Shakespeare and cipher numbers better than half the men in Denver. They can tell you why the stars wheel overhead and how to judge a storm's approach. They help birth calves and tend bees and know the value of honest work." He turned to face the lawyer. "What advantages exactly do they lack?" Mr. Blackwood shifted in his chair. The law," Sarah interrupted, "should protect children from those who would harm them. My sons are safe, loved, and learning things Harold could never teach them about dignity and true worth." She gathered the papers carefully, noting how the afternoon light caught the official seals and signatures. This was Harold's language, documents and declarations, using the law like a whip to drive people to his will. "Tell my brother-in-law that if he pursues this, I will tell every court in Colorado how he forged my husband's signatures, how he backdated documents while Michael lay dying." Her hands were steady as she folded the papers. "I have proof, Mr. Blackwood. I simply chose not to use it when we left, hoping he would leave us in peace." The lawyer's expression changed subtly. "Those are serious allegations, Mrs. Winters." "They are serious crimes," Thomas added, his educated accent becoming more pronounced. "I'm sure the Denver newspapers would find them fascinating. Prominent. Businessman defrauding his own brother's widow and children." Mr. Blackwood stood, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeves. "I will convey your position to Mr. Winters, though perhaps we could find some compromise." "The only compromise I'll accept," Sarah said firmly, "is Harold's complete withdrawal of any claim to my children, accompanied by the return of their rightful inheritance." After the lawyer departed, Sarah remained at the table, staring at the documents that had threatened to shatter their hard-won peace. Thomas moved behind her chair, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. "We'll fight him," he said simply. "The whole town will stand with us now. You've earned their respect 10 times over." Sarah covered his hand with hers, drawing strength from his quiet certainty. Through the window, she could hear Mrs. Morton praising the boys' garden work, her warm laugh mixing with their eager explanations of the new irrigation system they'd helped Thomas design. "We won't run this time," she said, and felt Thomas's grip tighten in response. "This is our home now. Harold will have to learn that some things can't be bought or bullied away. The autumn kitchen smelled of spices and fruit, steam rising from copper pots, where Sarah stirred preserves for the coming winter. Through the window, maple leaves danced on the breeze, their colours echoing the rich golds and crimsons of the jars lined up on her shelves. Peaches, apples, wild berries, each one a stored memory of summer sunshine. "That's the last batch of honey for the season," James announced, carefully placing 2 sealed jars beside her preserves. His pride in the golden liquid was well earned. The bee operation had flourished under his careful stewardship. "Your father would be amazed to see you now," Sarah said softly, touching his sun-browned cheek. "He always said you had a gentle touch with living things." James didn't pull away from her affection as he once might have. "Mr. Thomas says I have a natural feel for animal husbandry. He's getting me books on scientific breeding methods." From outside came the rhythmic sound of chopping. Thomas and William laying in the winter's wood supply. The younger boy had appointed himself Thomas's shadow in all such tasks, soaking up knowledge like the dry earth soaked up autumn rain. "Pa showed me how to tell which logs will burn longest," William called through the open door, his face glowing with exertion and pleasure. The word "pa" slipped out naturally now, though neither boy had planned or discussed the change. It had simply grown, like the winter wheat sprouting in their expanded fields. Sarah felt her heart catch at the title, but Thomas never presumed upon it. He accepted the boy's gradual claim on him with quiet grace, as he accepted all the changes they'd brought to his solitary life. She turned back to her preserving, adding a pinch of cinnamon to the simmering apples. The spice had been a gift from Mrs. Morton, along with a knowing smile and gentle hints about the proper timing of wedding announcements. The whole town seemed to be waiting, watching the slow dance between the widow and the rancher, with approving patience. "Something smells mighty fine in here," Thomas said, appearing in the doorway with an armload of wood. He stacked it neatly by the stove, his movements careful in the kitchen that had become Sarah's domain. "Reminds me of my mother's autumn preserving. She always said you could taste the love in home-canned food." "Your mother was a wise woman," Sarah replied, stirring the apples with extra care. "I wish I could have known her. She'd have loved you," Thomas said simply. "You have the same way of making a house feel like home." The words hung in the air between them, rich with meaning as the spices scenting the kitchen. Sarah felt the weight of Thomas's mother's quilt around her shoulders, though it lay folded in the chest upstairs. That quilt had wrapped her boys through. Their first uncertain nights here had covered them during storms, had become as much a part of their story as the preserves she now sealed in wax. William burst in with another load of kindling, breaking the moment. "Ma, can we have apple butter? On the bread tonight, the kind you made last week?" "If you've finished your chores," she answered, catching Thomas's smile at their domestic exchange. How far they'd come from that desperate day at the crossroads, when bread itself had been a luxury they couldn't count on. Later, after the preserves were sealed and the kitchen tidied, Sarah found Thomas on the porch, watching the sunset paint the hills in autumn glory. James was in the barn, checking the animals one last time, while William had fallen asleep over one of Thomas's books of poetry. "Winter's coming," Thomas observed, but there was no worry in his voice, only quiet satisfaction. "We're ready for it this year." Sarah thought of her lined shelves, the full root cellar, the carefully stored grain. More than that, she thought, of the strength they'd built together, the trust that had grown like her garden, the love that warmed their home more surely than the woodpile Thomas and William had stacked. "Yes," she said, standing close enough to feel the warmth of him in the cooling evening air. "We're ready for whatever comes." The marriage license lay unopened on Thomas's desk, its official seal catching the lamplight. He'd ridden to the county seat that morning to obtain it, taking more care with his appearance than Sarah had ever seen. Now, in the quiet evening hours, after the boys had gone to bed, he stood before her with the gravity of a man approaching an altar. "I know it's not been quite a year since you came to us," he began, his voice carrying the slight tremor she'd only heard once before, when he'd spoken of Elizabeth. "And if you feel it's too soon, I'll understand. But I want to do right by you, by the boys." Sarah sat in what had become her chair by the fire, her mending forgotten in her lap. "Thomas, please," he held up a hand, "let me say this proper." He moved to his desk, picking up not the license but a leather-bound book of poetry. "Been practicing these words for weeks now, though they still don't seem adequate." The lamplight softened his weathered features, reminding Sarah of that first night when he'd offered shelter to desperate strangers. She saw the same kindness in his face now, but tempered with something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster. "When Elizabeth died," he continued, "I thought that part of my life was over. Came out here to hide from the world, if I'm honest. But you and the boys—" He opened the book, though Sarah noticed his eyes didn't go to the pages. "You brought life back to this place, back to me." Sarah felt tears threatening but held them back. This moment deserved her full presence, her complete attention. "I'm not asking to replace Michael," Thomas said carefully. "Man shouldn't try to compete with memories. But I've come to love those boys like my own, and you—" He closed the book, set it aside. "You've become the heart of this home, Sarah. The heart of everything." He knelt beside her chair, not with the awkward gallantry of a younger man, but with the deliberate dignity of someone who knew exactly what he was offering and what he was asking. "I can't promise wealth or fancy things, but I can promise to cherish you, to be a father to your boys, to build a life that honors both our pasts while making something new." He reached for the license, held it out like an offering. "Will you marry me, Sarah Winters?" The question hung in the air, weighted with all the complexities of their situation. Sarah looked at the document in his hands. So different from the threatening papers Harold had sent, though they held equal legal power. This paper promised protection rather than control, love rather than obligation. "The boys," she began, but Thomas understood her concern. "I spoke with them first," he admitted, "wanted their blessing before presuming to ask. James said it was about time I made an honest woman of you." His smile held both humor and tenderness. William just asked if he could keep calling me Pa. Fresh tears threatened, but Sarah smiled through them. "You spoke with them first. Seemed right. We're a family already in all the ways that matter. This just makes it official in the eyes of the law and the church." He paused, uncertainty flickering across his features. "Unless you feel it's too soon, or—" Sarah placed her hand over his where it held the license. "I've been a wife before," she said softly. "I know what it means to build a life with someone, to trust them with your heart and your children's future." "And I've been a husband," Thomas replied. "Know the weight of those vows, the work it takes to keep them true." Their eyes met in the lamplight. Two people who had known both love and loss, who understood exactly what they were choosing. "Yes," Sarah said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Thomas Reed." He gathered her hands in his, pressing them gently to his chest, where she could feel his heart beating strong and steady. No passionate embrace, no dramatic declarations, just the quiet certainty of mature love finding its proper home. The license lay forgotten for the moment on her fallen mending, its official purpose transformed into something far more personal. A promise between two people who had found each other in the winter of their grief and chosen to build a spring together. Winter descended early that year, bringing with it challenges that tested their newfound bonds. The first blizzard caught them before all the fences had been fully mended, driving a portion of the herd into the lower pastures, where the grass was thin and the shelter inadequate. Sarah stood at the window watching Thomas and James struggle through knee-deep snow, carrying feed to the stranded cattle. The mended fence post near the barn stood as a testament to their earlier work. Thomas had shown both boys how to splice rope and repair rails, turning necessity into lessons about responsibility and care. "They'll be fine, Ma," William said, from his place by the fire, where he was practicing his letters. "Pa knows what he's doing." The casual confidence in the boy's voice warmed Sarah more than the crackling flames. A year ago, they'd been the ones frozen and lost. Now they were the ones offering shelter to creatures in need. When Thomas and James finally returned, their clothes crusted with ice, Sarah had hot coffee and stew waiting. She helped James out of his frozen coat while Thomas stomped snow from his boots. "Fence held," he reported, accepting the steaming cup she offered. "Your knots were perfect, James. Saved us hours of extra work." The boy straightened with pride, his cheeks red from cold and pleasure. "Could we reinforce the other sections?" "Tomorrow. I've been thinking about a new pattern for the cross-bracing." Thomas nodded, sharing a knowing look with Sarah. "Drew some diagrams while we were waiting out the worst of the storm. Want to take a look?" They bent over the rough sketches, father and son lost in discussion of physics and structural integrity. Sarah watched them, remembering Michael's dreams of sending James to university. Here on a humble ranch, their son was getting an education that combined practical skills with academic knowledge in ways no city school could match. Later that night, after the boys were asleep, Sarah found Thomas in the barn doing one final check on the animals. The lantern light caught the silver threading through his dark hair, and she was struck again by how right he looked in this place, among the creatures that depended on his care. "Thinking deep thoughts?" he asked, noting her expression. "Remembering last winter," she admitted, "how lost we were, how desperate." Thomas set down the lantern, drawing her into the warmth of his embrace. "Not lost anymore," he said simply, "though I reckon we're all still finding our way sometimes." She leaned into his strength, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and honest work. "The boys have changed so much. James with his engineering ideas, William turning into quite the scholar." "They're blooming where they're planted," Thomas said. "Like those wild roses you transplanted to the kitchen garden. Just needed the right soil and care." A restless horse nickered in its stall, and Thomas moved to check on it, his hands gentle on the animal's neck. Sarah watched him work, remembering his earlier words about making something new while honoring their pasts. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about names." Thomas looked up, understanding in his eyes. "For after the wedding, the boys should keep Winters as their middle names," she continued, "to honor Michael and their heritage. But I thought, for all of us to share the Reed name, a proper family." Thomas finished, his voice rough with emotion. "Michael's sons and Elizabeth's husband making something new together." The mended fence post took on new meaning in Sarah's mind. Broken pieces carefully rejoined, stronger at the mended places than they had been before. Like their family, pieced together from loss and hope, bound by choice rather than just blood. Outside, the winter wind howled around the barn's sturdy walls, but inside was all warmth and certainty. Tomorrow would bring more challenges. Stranded, cattle to tend, fences to reinforce, lessons to teach, but they would face them together, each playing their part in the intricate dance of family life. "Spring will come," Thomas said, as if reading her thoughts. "It always does." Sarah smiled, thinking of the seeds already ordered for next year's garden, the plans drawn up for the new schoolhouse, the future taking shape with each passing day. "Yes," she agreed, "it always does." Spring brought more than just new growth to the Reed Ranch. One bright morning, Thomas gathered the family by the front gate, where he'd been working in secret for the past week. There, freshly mounted on sturdy posts, hung a new sign that made Sarah's breath catch, "Reed Family Ranch, Esther, 1885, with all their names carved beneath. Thomas, Sarah, James, and William. "Thought it was time," Thomas said quietly, watching their faces. "If you approve," James ran his fingers over the carved letters of his name. "You included the date you found us." "That's when the ranch truly began," Thomas replied. "Everything before was just preparation." Sarah touched the smooth wood, feeling the care that had gone into each letter. The sign represented more than just ownership. It was a declaration to the world, a statement of belonging that even Harold couldn't dispute. The decision to make their engagement public came naturally after that. Mrs. Morton had been dropping increasingly pointed hints about the proper timing of such announcements, and the spring social season was approaching. "We could wait until summer," Thomas offered one evening after the boys had gone up to bed. "Give people more time to gossip and speculate." Sarah smiled, setting aside her sewing. "I think they've had quite enough time for that already." Indeed, the town had been watching their slow courtship with poorly concealed interest. The story of the lonely rancher and the widow he'd saved from winter's grip had taken on almost mythical qualities in local retellings. "Reverend Phillips asked about wedding dates again," Thomas admitted. "Says he's had to fend off quite a few inquiries from his more curious parishioners." Sarah laughed softly. Mrs. Wheeler must be beside herself, not knowing the details yet. "Let them wander a bit longer," Thomas suggested, his eyes twinkling. "Might do some of them good to practice patience." But they both knew the time had come. The next Sunday, they drove to church together as they had so many times before, but today felt different. Sarah wore her best dress. The boys had their hair slicked down with water, and Thomas had donned the new collar Sarah had bought him in Denver. The announcement was simple and dignified, just like their love. Reverend Phillips beamed as he shared the news with his congregation, and Sarah felt the warmth of genuine pleasure in the responses that followed. Even Mrs. Wheeler's congratulations seemed sincere, though she couldn't resist adding, "I knew from the first, of course." It was James who captured the moment's true significance, speaking up during the flood of well wishes after the service. "Does this mean we're officially a family now?" "We've been a family," Thomas replied, resting his hand on the boy's shoulder. "This just lets everyone else know it too." Back at the ranch, the new sign caught the spring sunlight. It's fresh carved, letters sharp and clear. William insisted on showing it to every visitor, proudly pointing out how his name matched the others in size and significance. Sarah found Thomas standing before it that evening, his expression thoughtful in the fading light. "Having second thoughts?" she asked lightly, though her heart skipped a beat until he turned to smile at her. "Only about whether we ordered enough food for the wedding feast," he teased. "Mrs. Morton's list of essential guests grows longer by the day." She leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "We could still elope and deny the county its first real celebration since winter. They'd never forgive us." His arm slipped around her waist, natural as breathing. "Besides, I want everyone to see." "See what?" "How lucky I am. How blessed we all are." He gestured toward the house where lamplight spilled from the windows, and the boys' voices could be heard discussing their latest project. A year ago, this was just a ranch. Now it's a home. The sign caught the last rays of sunset, the words "Reed Family Ranch" glowing like a promise kept, a future secured. Sarah thought of another sign she'd seen recently, the "Room to Let" notice in the window of Mrs. Peterson's boarding house, where the sheriff had once suggested she stay. How different their lives would have been if she'd chosen that safer, more conventional path. "No regrets?" Thomas asked softly, reading her silence. Sarah shook her head, remembering the desperate woman she'd been at that snowy crossroads. "Only that we didn't put the sign up sooner." The wedding ring Thomas had chosen caught the light differently than Sarah's first, where Michael's ring had been a bright gold band. Speaking of youth and promise, this one was crafted from old silver, its pattern subtle and complex. Mrs. Morton had helped him select it from the Denver jeweler's offerings, declaring it just right for a love that's aged into something precious. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and warm, with spring flowers dotting the ranch's rolling pastures. They decided to hold the wedding at home rather than in town, transforming the barn into a chapel with lanterns and wild roses. The whole county seemed to have turned out, their wagons and buggies creating an impromptu village in the lower field. "You look beautiful, Mama," William whispered as Sarah adjusted his tie. They stood in the quiet of the house while guests gathered. Outside, James was with Thomas, serving as his father's best man with a gravity that made Sarah's heart swell. "And you look very handsome." She smoothed his hair, remembering another morning when they'd huddled together by a cold roadside. "Are you ready?" William nodded solemnly. "I've been practicing with the ring like Pa showed me." The new ring nestled in a small pouch in William's pocket, its weight carrying the promise of their future. Sarah touched her old ring, now hanging on a chain around her neck. "Your father would be proud of you, of both of you. He'd be happy you found Pa," William said with a child's simple certainty. "James says he's watching over us, making sure we're taken care of." Sarah blinked back tears, careful not to disturb the lace veil Mrs. Morton had insisted on lending her. "Yes, I believe he is." The ceremony itself was both simpler and more profound than Sarah had expected. She walked from the house to the barn on James's arm, her older son matching his pace to hers with careful dignity. William preceded them, practically bursting with the importance of his ring-bearer duties. Thomas waited by the flower-decked altar they'd created from hay bales and Mrs. Wheeler's best quilts. His eyes, when they met Sarah's, held such depth of feeling that she nearly forgot to breathe. He'd traded his usual work clothes for a proper suit, but his hands were still those of a working man, strong, capable, gentle in their purpose. Reverend Phillips spoke of new beginnings and God's grace in bringing healing to wounded hearts. But it was the boys' part in the ceremony that touched the gathered crowd most deeply. James stood tall beside Thomas, while William presented the ring with perfect timing, his small face solemn with joy. "With this ring," Thomas's voice carried clear and steady through the barn, "I pledge not just my love and fidelity to you, Sarah, but my heart and home to our family, to James and William, to the memory of those we've loved before, and to the future God grants us together." Sarah's response, practiced so carefully in private, came from a deeper place than memory. "With this ring, I join my life to yours, bringing all that I am and all that I love into your keeping, trusting in the goodness that brought us together and the strength that will carry us forward." The silver ring slipped onto her finger beside the gold one she'd kept through all their trials, not replacing the old, but complementing it, just as this new love stood beside her memories of Michael, each precious in its own way. When Reverend Phillips pronounced them man and wife, the boys were the first to embrace them, creating a family circle that drew appreciative murmurs from the crowd. Mrs. Morton dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief while Sheriff Morton cleared his throat. Suspiciously often. The celebration that followed filled the ranch with more laughter and music than its walls had ever known. Tables groaned with food brought by every family in the county, and children played tag between the dancing couples. Even Mrs. Wheeler, unbent enough to declare it a perfect country wedding, just right for them. But Sarah's clearest memory of that day would always be the quiet moment when Thomas took her hand to lead her in their first dance. The new ring caught the lantern light, its silver surface reflecting the faces of their sons, their friends, their future, all bound together in the simple truth of love renewed and family found. The family portrait hung in the parlor, taken on the first anniversary of their wedding. The photographer from Denver had captured them perfectly, Thomas and Sarah seated, with James and William standing tall behind them. What struck visitors most was not the formal arrangement or their Sunday best clothes, but the natural ease between them. The way William's hand rested on Thomas's shoulder, how James stood protectively close to Sarah, the subtle tilt of Thomas's head toward his. "Wife, best investment we ever made," Thomas declared, watching Sarah arrange wildflowers beneath the photograph. "Though I still say the camera adds years to a man." "Nonsense," Sarah replied, adjusting a stem of purple aster. "It shows exactly what you are, a distinguished rancher and father." The ranch had prospered beyond their hopes in the year since their wedding. James's bee operation now supplied honey to shops as far as Denver, while William's careful records of rainfall and crop yields had helped Thomas optimize their farming practices. The schoolhouse Thomas had dreamed of was under construction, with Sarah set to teach the younger children of neighboring ranches. "Pa!" William's voice carried from outside. "The new mayor's acting strange." Thomas grabbed his hat, sharing a knowing look with Sarah. At 10 years old, William had developed an almost uncanny sense about their animals' needs. More often than not, his hunches proved right. Indeed, within hours, the mare delivered a healthy foal, with William attending, his first birth under Thomas's guidance. The boy's face shone with wonder as the spindly-legged creature found its feet. "Just like you said, Pa, watch her ears, and you'll know when it's time." Thomas ruffled his son's hair, pride evident in his expression. "You've got a gift, boy. Your father had it too, from what your ma tells me." William didn't stiffen at the mention of Michael, as he once might have. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "Mama says I get my gentleness with animals from him, and my stubborn determination from you." "That's so," Thomas chuckled. "Reckon she might be right about both." Later that evening, as Sarah worked on her lesson plans for the new school, James brought in his latest diagrams for expanding the beehives. At 12, he'd grown tall and thoughtful, combining Thomas's patience with Michael's quick intelligence. "Mr. Peterson at the bank says we might get a loan for the expansion," he reported, spreading the careful drawings on the table. "Said our credit's good. What with the honey business doing so well?" Thomas studied the plans with proper seriousness. "Good work on the cost estimates, though you might want to factor in extra for winter protection." Sarah watched them work, her heart full. James had inherited Michael's head for business, but Thomas had taught him to temper ambition with careful planning. The result was a young man who thought deeply about both possibilities and responsibilities. The photographer had captured something of this too. The quiet confidence in James's stance, the subtle lift of his chin that spoke of pride without arrogance. Looking at the portrait, visitors often remarked on how much the boy resembled Thomas, never realizing the resemblance came not from blood, but from daily example. "Mama." William appeared at her elbow, clutching one of Thomas's books of poetry. "Could you explain this part about the caged bird? Pa says you read it best." Sarah set aside her lessons, making room for him beside her. These quiet evening moments had become precious routines, William reading poetry, while James and Thomas discussed business, the lamplight warm on the family portrait that watched over them all. Thomas's voice drifted over from the table. "Now about these ventilation improvements you've designed," James's reply came eagerly. "I've been studying the way wind moves across the ranch. If we position the new hives just so," Sarah smiled, remembering the desperate prayers she'd once offered for her son's future. God had answered with more abundance than she could have imagined, giving them not just security, but purpose, not just shelter, but true belonging. The portrait caught the last rays of sunset through the window, the glass reflecting the living reality of their family, changed, grown, strengthened by time and trust and love. Not just surviving now, but thriving, putting down roots deep into the soil of their shared life. The deed to the new land arrived the same day as Harold's letter. Sarah held both papers in her hands, marveling at the contrast, one representing growth and possibility, the other a final echo of past pain. The deed bore Thomas's careful signature beside hers, officially expanding the ranch to include the south pasture they'd long dreamed of cultivating. Harold's letter, by contrast, carried only his own bold scrawl. "You don't have to read it," Thomas said quietly, watching her face. "Yes, I do." Sarah broke the seal, James and William gathering close as she unfolded the expensive paper. "We face things together now." Harold's words were different this time. No threats, no legal posturing. Instead, he wrote of Margaret's passing, of thoughts turned toward legacy and redemption. He spoke of money set aside for the boy's education, of Michael's pocket watch preserved for James, of regret. "He wants to visit," Sarah said finally, looking up at her family. "To make amends," he says. James, nearly as tall as Thomas now, took the letter from her gentle hands. "Do we trust him?" "That's not the question," Thomas replied, surprising them all. "Question is, do we trust ourselves enough to offer grace?" William, who barely remembered his uncle, frowned thoughtfully. "The Bible says to forgive our enemies. It also says to be wise as serpents," Thomas reminded him, "though gentle as doves." Sarah touched the deed to their new land, its crisp promise grounding her. "We're not the desperate family he once threatened. We're stronger now." The decision to receive Harold was not made lightly. They prepared for his visit with the same careful attention they gave to any challenge. Together, thoughtfully, each member of the family having their say. When Harold's carriage finally arrived, the contrast between past and present couldn't have been clearer. He found not a helpless widow and her fatherless sons, but a prosperous family standing united on their own land. The ranch's success was evident in the well-maintained buildings, the healthy livestock, the thriving fields. "Sarah." Harold's voice carried none of its old arrogance as he descended from the carriage. Age and grief had bent his shoulders, softened his sharp edges. "You look well. We are well," she replied simply, Thomas's solid presence beside her lending strength to her words. Harold's eyes moved to the boys, widening at their growth and confidence. James stood straight-backed in a clean work shirt, his father's commanding height evident in his bearing. William, dressed similarly, met his uncle's gaze without fear. "My God," Harold whispered, "they're the image of Michael." "They're their own men," Thomas corrected quietly, "though they do their father proud." The afternoon unfolded with careful courtesy on all sides. Harold presented the pocket watch to James, who accepted it with grave dignity. He spoke of investments set aside, of wrongs he wished to right, of lessons learned too late about the true meaning of family. "I was wrong," he said finally, as they sat in the parlor over Sarah's good coffee. "About everything. I thought I was protecting Michael's legacy, but I nearly destroyed it instead." Sarah felt Thomas's hand find hers, their matching rings catching the afternoon light. "Michael's legacy lives in his sons," she said, "in their character, their kindness, their strength. Those things can't be stolen or locked away in a bank vault." "No," Harold agreed, watching William explain their rainfall tracking system to his coachman outside. "They certainly cannot." Before leaving, Harold stood long before the family portrait, studying the happiness evident in every face. "You've built something remarkable here," he said, "something Michael would have celebrated." "We have," Thomas replied, his arm steady around Sarah's waist, "though not alone. Every hand that helped us, every challenge that tested us, even those who opposed us, all played their part in making us who we are." The deed to the new land lay on Thomas's desk throughout the visit, a quiet reminder of their security and growth. When Harold's carriage finally departed, the family stood together, watching it disappear down the road that had once led Sarah and her boys to sanctuary. "Well," Thomas said softly, "reckon that's the last ghost laid to rest." Sarah leaned into his embrace, feeling James and William move to join them. "Not ghosts," she corrected, "just the past making its peace with the present." 5 years after Harold's visit, Sarah found the family journal while spring cleaning the study. Its leather cover had softened with use, pages thick with pressed flowers, drawings, and the collected stories of their life together. Thomas had started it the day after their wedding, his educated hand recording not just the practical details of ranch life, but the precious moments that shaped their family. "Found something interesting?" Thomas asked, coming in from his morning rounds. His hair had more silver now, but his eyes still held the same gentle strength that had first offered her shelter on that winter road. "Just remembering," she replied, turning pages carefully. Here was William's first sketch of the schoolhouse, where Sarah now taught. There, James's calculations for the honey operation that had grown into a thriving business. "Hard to believe how much has changed," Thomas said, settling into his chair beside her, "though some things remain constant." Indeed, the ranch had transformed over the years. The original buildings now formed the heart of a larger operation, with the new schoolhouse drawing families from miles around. James, at 17, managed much of the business side, his natural gift for numbers complementing Thomas's practical experience. William, 15 and tall as his brother, had developed their modest veterinary practice into something the whole county relied upon. Sarah paused at a page where pressed wildflowers marked their first anniversary. Remember when Mrs. Wheeler said we'd never last? That a marriage born of convenience couldn't grow into true love? Thomas chuckled, the sound rich with contentment. Reckon we proved her wrong on that count. The journal held evidence of that truth in 100 small ways. Notes about family dinners and shared dreams, pressed leaves from the garden they'd expanded together, careful records of each boy's growth and accomplishments. Between the lines of daily records lay the story of 4 people becoming something greater than themselves. "Ma! Pa!" William's voice carried from outside. "The Petersons' mare is foaling." They rose together, moving with the easy synchronization of long partnership. Through the window they could see James already preparing the barn, his movements sure and confident. William had his medical kit ready, every bit the young professional he was becoming. "Should I add this to the journal?" Sarah asked, reaching for her pen. "Of course." Thomas smiled. "It's all part of our story." Later that evening, after a successful delivery that showcased both boys' skills, the family gathered in the study. James was updating their accounts, his neat figures showing another profitable quarter. William sketched the new foal, adding to his growing collection of animal studies. The journal lay open on Sarah's desk, recording not just today's events, but their dreams for tomorrow. "I've been thinking," James said, looking up from his ledger, "about expanding the honey operation further north. There's good land available, and with the railroad coming—" "Might work," Thomas mused, "though we'd need to consider the impact on the wild bee populations William's been studying." Sarah watched her family discuss the future, their conversation, weaving together James's business sense, William's environmental concerns, and Thomas's practical wisdom. The journal's pages held the seeds of this moment, records of early lessons, small victories, gradual growth that had brought them here. "You're quiet tonight, Mama," William observed, setting aside his sketch. "Just grateful," she replied, thinking about that day at the crossroads, how close we came to taking a different path. Thomas reached for her hand, their rings catching. "The lamplight. No other path would have led us here," he said simply. The journal's final pages remained empty, waiting for more stories, more dreams, more life to fill them. Sarah picked up her pen, beginning a new entry. "Today, as spring brings new life to the ranch, I'm reminded of all the ways love can grow when planted in fertile soil. Our family, born in winter's darkness, has bloomed into something more beautiful than I could have imagined. The boys their father dreamed of educating have become men any parent would be proud of. The shelter a kind stranger offered has become a true home, and the love that started as gratitude has deepened into the very foundation of our lives. To whoever reads this journal in years to come, know that happiness isn't always found where you expect it. Sometimes it waits at a snowy crossroads, in the gentle eyes of a stranger, in the brave hearts of children, in the willingness to build something new from life's broken pieces. This is our story, but it's also a testament to hope, to second chances, to the family we choose and the love we grow day by day, year by year, together.